The prairie wind carried with it a whisper of secrets that autumn morning, stirring the dry cornstalks and rattling the boards of the old barn. The rising sun painted the horizon in copper and gold, but inside the wooden structure, the shadows clung to the corners like stubborn memories. Life on the frontier was never simple, and the people who lived here knew that every day carried its share of trials. For one little girl with wide eyes and tangled hair, it was just another morning on the farm, till she stumbled upon something that would change everything. Her small feet pattered across the packed dirt as she chased after a stray kitten. The barn had always been a place of comfort to her, filled with the scent of hay and the creak of rafters that seemed to sing with the wind. But that morning, as she stepped inside, her kitten froze and hissed. The little girl followed its gaze and saw a figure slumped in the hay, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of breathing. The woman's dress was torn, her face pale and streaked with dust, and one of her arms was wrapped across her side as though she were holding herself together. The barn seemed to hold its breath as the little girl whispered in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear, "Is that my new mama?" She didn't know why the words slipped out, but something about the stranger felt different. The woman was broken, wounded, yet there was a gentleness about her, even in her stillness. The farm had been quiet since her real mama passed. Her father worked long hours, his hands rough from the plow, and his face lined with more than just age. He had tried to fill the silence with chores and with stern rules, but silence has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you sweep it away. For the girl, the barn was where she played, where she dreamed of someone coming back to tuck her in at night and brush her hair in the mornings. Now, here lay a stranger, like a gift wrapped in sorrow and mystery. The child's heart pounded with curiosity, but also with the kind of fear she couldn't name. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the straw. The woman stirred, letting out a weak sound that carried both pain and longing. The little girl crouched down, tilting her head the way children do when they're trying to solve a puzzle. Outside, the farm carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Chickens scratched the ground, a dog barked in the distance, and the steady clink of metal told that her father was at work in the blacksmith shed. He had no idea what his daughter was seeing. No idea that a stranger had found her way into their barn and collapsed as if the earth itself had given up holding her. The girl reached out, her tiny hand brushing the edge of the woman's sleeve. It was damp with blood. She pulled back quickly, her breath catching, but the stranger's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. They were tired, but there was something kind buried deep in them, a softness that felt almost like home. The girl wanted to call for her father, but something kept her still. A child's instinct, sharper than most grown folks reckon, told her that this was a secret too fragile to shout about. Life in the old American countryside was full of rumors. Bandits roamed the roads, soldiers passed through with heavy boots, and settlers told stories by firelight of people who vanished in the night. Maybe this woman was running from something. Maybe she was running to something. Whatever her story, it had carried her right here, into a barn that had been empty for far too long. The girl pressed her lips together and studied the stranger. She thought about the empty seat at the table and the way her father's eyes grew distant when he thought no one was looking. She remembered how sometimes she would ask if things could ever be different, and he would just shake his head. Maybe different had finally come walking through their fields, bleeding but alive. The sound of boots crunching on gravel startled her. Her father was coming closer, his steady stride moving toward the barn. The girl's heart thudded as she looked between the stranger and the doorway. She didn't know what he would say if he found the woman here. He might send her away. He might not even let her live long enough to explain. Out here, trust was a rare thing, and danger often wore a friendly face. The little girl glanced back at the woman, who tried to form words but failed. Instead, her hand reached weakly toward the child, then dropped back to the straw. The girl's breath quickened. She felt torn between the duty to call for her father and the urge to protect this mysterious soul who had fallen into their lives. The barn door creaked as sunlight spilled across the floorboards. The father's tall frame cast a shadow long and heavy, stretching toward where the woman lay hidden in the hay. His voice rang out, calm but firm, calling for his daughter. She froze, her small hands clenched into fists. Her eyes darted to the stranger, then back to the doorway. The weight of choice pressed on her tiny shoulders, though she could not yet understand just how heavy it truly was. The prairie wind rattled the loose boards again, as if echoing the secret she was holding inside. The wounded woman let out another faint sound, too quiet for her father to hear, but enough to pull the child closer once more. She bent her head low, whispering words only the stranger could hear. She didn't know what made her speak them, didn't know if they were true, but in her heart they felt right. Her father's steps grew louder. Any second now he would see. The girl took a deep breath, her pulse racing, her mind filled with questions too big for someone so small. Was this woman sent to them by fate? Was she trouble come knocking? Or was she something else entirely, something that could change the shape of their family forever? The barn seemed smaller with every second, the air thicker, the silence heavier. The kitten mewed softly, as if urging her to decide. The little girl's lips parted, ready to call out, to tell her father what she had found. But at that very moment the woman's eyes opened fully and locked with hers. There was a plea in them, a desperate spark that begged for silence. The girl swallowed hard, torn between two worlds, her father's shadow stretching closer and the stranger's gaze holding her in place. The frontier was a place of choices, of risks and consequences, and she was about to make one that would change everything. The barn door swung wider, filling the room with light. Her father's voice grew sharper as he called her name again. And just as she opened her mouth to speak, the stranger's hand reached out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, pulling her into the circle of a secret that neither of them could escape. The girl's heart thundered. Her father's boots echoed against the barn floor, and the wounded woman's breath came fast and shallow. For a moment, all three lives hung in the balance, caught between discovery and silence, between fear and trust. The question whispered by the little girl still lingered in the air, unanswered and haunting. Was this her new mama, or was this the beginning of something far more dangerous? The answer lay just a breath away, but the moment cracked open into silence as the father stepped fully inside. His eyes narrowing at the sight before him. The father's shadow cut across the straw, long and heavy, and the little girl felt her heart rise into her throat. His eyes moved from her to the woman lying half-hidden in the hay, and for a moment the whole barn seemed to freeze. He didn't speak right away. His jaw tightened, his chest rose with a deep breath, and his gaze narrowed on the stranger, who had somehow found her way into their world. The little girl held her breath, not knowing whether to run to him or shield the woman with her tiny frame. The man had seen many things in his years on the land, but nothing had prepared him for this. A wounded stranger bleeding in his barn was not the kind of surprise any farmer wanted, not in times like these. On the frontier, danger often wore no clear face. A wounded woman might have been the victim of cruelty, or she might have been part of it. Trust was a currency more costly than gold, and he had already lost too much in his life to spend it carelessly. Still, he couldn't ignore the way his daughter's wide eyes clung to the stranger, pleading without words. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. The woman's eyes fluttered, and for a moment he saw fear, then exhaustion, then something else. Her lips parted as if to speak, but only a hoarse sound escaped. His daughter leaned toward her, whispering something he couldn't hear, her small hand still clasped in the stranger's. The father crouched down, scanning the wound at her side. Blood had seeped through the fabric, dark and sticky, and her skin carried the pale look of someone who had traveled far past their strength. She wasn't armed, not that he could see, but he didn't lower his guard. Outlaws had been known to use tricks, and weakness could be a mask. His thoughts tangled as he tried to piece together what might have brought her here. Had she stumbled across the farm by accident, or had she been running from someone? The field stretched for miles in every direction, yet she had collapsed right here under his roof. That was no accident in his mind. The little girl tugged at his sleeve, her voice trembling but certain. She needs help. Her words cut through the silence, simple yet heavy. He looked at his daughter and saw more than just a child's plea. He saw the shadow of his late wife in her expression, that same quiet strength that had guided their family through hard times. His heart twisted. He couldn't ignore that memory, nor the hope glimmering in his daughter's eyes. Still, hope could be dangerous. He rose slowly, his figure tall and stern against the light pouring in from the barn door. "Fetch some water," he told his daughter, his tone even but low. She hesitated, as if worried he might change his mind, then hurried out with quick steps. The sound of the well crank began turning in the distance, and he was left alone with the stranger. The woman's eyes opened again, holding his gaze for a brief, unsteady moment. They were weary, but not wild, cautious, but not cruel. She tried again to speak, and this time, A faint whisper came through. He leaned closer, though he wasn't sure why. "Please," she said, her voice rough as gravel. One word carried weight. It was the sound of someone who had been pushed too far, someone who had fought to keep going when most would have given up. He clenched his jaw, torn between suspicion and the faint stir of compassion he had buried deep since his wife's passing. His daughter returned with a bucket of water, her small hands struggling with the weight. She set it down beside him, her face filled with determination. The father soaked a rag, wrung it out, and pressed it against the woman's wound, careful but firm. She flinched, a soft gasp escaping her lips, but she didn't pull away. As he worked, the barn filled with the sounds of breathing and the rustle of straw. The little girl knelt close, watching every movement, as though she were afraid the woman might vanish if she looked away. The father said nothing, but inside his mind, questions spun like a storm. Who was she? What road had led her here, and what dangers might come trailing after her? The woman closed her eyes again, the rag pressed against her side, slowing the bleeding, but not stopping it. She was in no state to tell her story. Not yet. The father knew she would need rest and more than a little luck to survive. Still, he hesitated. To bring a stranger under his roof was to invite risk, but to turn her away would weigh heavily on his conscience. His daughter's hopeful gaze pressed the choice even harder against his heart. The little girl whispered again, the words almost lost in the quiet. "Is she going to stay?" The father didn't answer. He rose and paced a short distance, his boots thudding against the barn floor. He thought of the men who rode the roads at night, their guns glinting in the moonlight, their voices harsh with threats. He thought of the stories told in town about raids, about women taken, about travelers left for dead along lonely trails. Maybe this stranger had crossed paths with such men. So, they might not be far behind. The barn suddenly felt smaller, more fragile against the wide world beyond. The wind outside rattled the loose boards again, as if warning him that time was short. Looked at the woman once more, then at his daughter, whose face had softened into quiet hope. He knew already what choice he would make, though he didn't yet speak it aloud. The stranger stirred again, her breathing uneven, and her hand reached weakly toward the girl as though searching for something familiar. The child caught her fingers gently and held them tight. In that small touch, a bond seemed to spark, silent but strong, as if fate itself had stitched them together. The father turned his face toward the doorway, his eyes scanning the horizon. Didn't trust chance, and he didn't believe in coincidences. Somewhere out there, someone might be looking for this woman. Whether they were friend or foe was a question that hung heavy in the air, unanswered and dangerous. The little girl broke the silence once more, her voice small but steady. "Papa, she needs us." He didn't look at her, not right away. His gaze lingered on the fields stretching into the distance, the tall grasses swaying in the wind. Finally he spoke, his words rough but certain. "Then we'll see what tomorrow brings." The barn fell quiet after that, though the tension lingered like a storm on the horizon. The woman's breathing steadied slightly, but her rest was fragile. The father gathered what blankets he could find, spreading them beneath her, while his daughter hovered close, unwilling to let go of the stranger's hand. Night would come soon, bringing with it the uncertainty of what lay beyond the farm. For now, they could do nothing but wait, each of them holding their own questions in silence. The little girl's whispered hopes still floated in the air, unanswered, yet stronger than fear. The prairie wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats, faint but real, a reminder that peace never lasted long in this land. And as the shadows deepened across the fields, the father knew the barn no longer held just straw and tools. It now held a secret that could either mend what had been broken or shatter what little they had left. The little girl lay down beside the wounded woman, her eyes heavy with sleep, though her hand remained wrapped around the stranger's. The father kept watch at the doorway, his rifle close at hand, his mind sharp with worry. He didn't know who would ride onto their land next, or what story the woman would tell when her voice returned. The night whispered across the plains, carrying questions without answers. And inside the barn, 3 lives hung together in uneasy silence, bound by fate and shadowed by the mystery of what tomorrow might reveal. The night stretched long, filled with uneasy silence and the distant call of coyotes. The father sat near the barn door, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes never leaving the open fields. The wounded woman lay in the straw, her breathing uneven, her face pale under the faint glow of the lantern. His daughter had fallen asleep curled up beside her, one small hand still wrapped around the stranger's fingers. That picture stirred something inside him, a mix of tenderness and worry, because nothing about this situation was simple. As the hours passed, the man kept listening. Every rustle of grass outside, every faint sound carried on the wind set his nerves on edge. This land had a way of keeping men honest. You didn't survive out here by ignoring warnings, and the faint hoofbeats he thought he had heard earlier still echoed in his mind. He wondered if riders were moving under the cover of night, searching for the woman lying in his barn. When dawn broke, the little girl stirred first. She rubbed her eyes and whispered a sleepy good morning to the stranger, as though she had always been part of their world. The father watched closely, waiting to see if the woman would stir, and at last her eyes opened. They were still clouded with pain, but she seemed more present than the night before. She tried to push herself up, but the effort was too much. "You need rest," he said, his voice calm but firm. Her gaze flicked to him, then softened when it landed on the child. She managed a weak nod, as though agreeing only for the girl's sake. He poured her a cup of water and helped her lift it to her lips. She drank slowly, her hands trembling, then sank back against the blankets. The girl was quick to chatter, filling the quiet with questions. "Where did you come from? Did you get lost? Did someone hurt you? Are you going to stay here with us?" The woman tried to answer, but only fragments came through. A place to the east, a group of men, a long road, and then silence again. Her words were broken, like pieces of a story scattered in the wind. The father listened closely, not missing the shadow that crossed her face when she mentioned the men. He knew enough to understand this wasn't a chance encounter. Someone had done this to her, and someone might still be looking. That thought settled heavy on his shoulders, yet he couldn't bring himself to turn her out. As the day went on, he tried to carry on with chores, but his mind never strayed far from the barn. The fields needed tending, the animals needed care, yet every sound made him glance back over his shoulder. He was torn between duty to the land and duty to the stranger fate had dropped in his path. Meanwhile, the little girl grew more attached. She brought scraps of bread and milk to the woman, sat beside her, humming simple songs, and even brushed her hair with the care only a child could give. The woman seemed to find comfort in those small gestures, though her eyes often carried a faraway look, as though haunted by things she dared not speak. By the second night, the father's unease deepened. He could not ignore the faint tracks he had seen near the edge of the property that morning. Horses had passed there not long ago, their trails cutting too close for comfort. He said nothing to his daughter, but the worry settled in his gut like a stone. That evening, after the girl had gone to bed, he returned to the barn. The woman's eyes were open, watching him. In the quiet, he asked her directly, "Who are you running from?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then her lips moved, and though her voice was still weak, there was strength in her words. "Men who don't stop, men who take what they want." He nodded, though it was not the answer he had wanted. It confirmed what he already feared. She had not just stumbled into his barn. She had been driven there, and those men might still be hunting her. He didn't press for details that night, but her words stayed with him. The plains could hide trouble, but they could also carry it straight to your door. Days passed, and the woman's strength began to return little by little. She could sit up for short stretches, though the wound at her side still pained her. She spoke more, but always carefully, never giving names or places. The little girl asked again and again if she would stay, and though the woman never answered directly, her eyes softened each time, as though she wished she could promise something she wasn't sure of herself. The father tried to keep life steady, but the air around the farm felt heavier with each passing day. He started taking longer walks at the edge of the property looking for signs. Twice he found ash from campfires that weren't his, still warm enough to tell him others were close. He returned each time with a deeper frown, more certain that trouble was drawing near. The little girl noticed his worry, though he tried to hide it. One night she asked him softly, "Papa, are the bad men coming?" He didn't answer, not wanting to put fear into her heart, but his silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, a strange bond was forming between the girl and the wounded woman. It wasn't just kindness or sympathy. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The child would sit beside her, telling stories of her mama who had passed, and the woman would listen with tears shining in her tired eyes. Sometimes she would whisper, "You were brave," and the girl would smile as though those words filled an empty place inside her. The father saw all this and wrestled with his own feelings. Part of him wanted to send the woman away, to protect his daughter from whatever dangers followed her. But another part saw the way the girl's laughter had returned, the way her eyes shone with something he hadn't seen in a long while. And though he would never say it aloud, he felt it too, the quiet stirrings of a presence that eased the loneliness in their home. But comfort was fragile in a land like this. Late one afternoon, the dog barked wildly near the edge of the fields. The father grabbed his rifle and hurried out, his daughter following before he could stop her. At the far ridge, dust rose in the distance. Riders, too many to be neighbors, too straight a line to be travelers lost on the prairie. The little girl clutched his arm, her eyes wide. "Papa, are they coming here?" He didn't answer, only pulled her close and turned back toward the house. His mind raced. If they were the men the woman had spoken of, then time was running short. That night, he sat in the barn again, facing the woman with the truth heavy in his voice. "They're coming. Whoever you left behind, they're closing in." Her face tightened, fear flickering across her features before she masked it. She tried to speak, but faltered. At last she whispered, "If they find me here, they'll take more than me." The father's jaw clenched. He knew what she meant. His farm, his daughter, his very life, all of it could be swept up in whatever storm had driven her to his door. Still, when the little girl came into the barn, carrying her small blanket to curl up beside the stranger once more, he couldn't bring himself to push her away. He watched as the woman stroked his daughter's hair with trembling fingers, and he felt the weight of choice pressing harder than ever. The prairie outside was wide and quiet, but it carried danger on every wind. In the coming days, that danger would arrive at his door. And when it did, he would have to decide whether to shield the woman who had stumbled into their lives, or to turn her away before everything he had left was lost. For now, the barn held only shadows, unspoken words, and the steady rhythm of three hearts bound together by chance and by the storm was gathering on the horizon. The prairie nights had grown colder, and each gust of wind seemed to carry the promise of change. The father had not slept properly in days, his ears tuned to every sound, his eyes searching the horizon each morning and each dusk. He knew the riders were coming closer. He could almost feel their presence pressing in on the farm like a storm creeping across the plains. The wounded woman had gained some strength, but not enough. She could stand for short stretches, lean against the barn wall, and whisper longer sentences now. Yet the shadows in her eyes told him that fear was still close behind her. The little girl, though young, sensed everything. Children often do. She noticed the way her father kept the rifle closer, the way his eyes lingered too long on the fields, the way his voice had grown sharper when he gave instructions. She also noticed the way the woman looked at the door whenever the wind rattled it, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. One evening, when the sun burned low and red in the west, the father climbed the ridge to scan the horizon. He saw dust again, thicker this time, and the faint glint of sunlight off metal. They were not neighbors. They were not passing through. Whoever they were, they had marked their course toward this land. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt the heavy weight of helplessness. He was one man with a child and a stranger to protect. When he came down from the ridge, his daughter was waiting for him at the bottom, her small hands clenched into fists. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice trembling. He paused, looking into her eyes. He had always tried to shield her from hard truths, but this time there was no use. "Yes," he said simply, "they're coming." She nodded, too solemn for her years, and slipped her hand into his. He felt her fingers cold against his calloused palm, and his heart ached at the thought of what lay ahead. Back in the barn, the woman tried to rise when she saw his expression. Her breath came quick, her hand clutching at her side. "How many?" she asked, her voice ragged. "Enough," he replied. "Too many for comfort." She closed her eyes briefly, as if the answer confirmed what she already knew. "They won't stop, not until they have me back." The little girl spoke before he could reply. "But you're not going back. You're staying here with us." She said it with a conviction that made the woman's eyes shine with unshed tears. The father watched them both, torn between anger and pity. He wanted answers, but each time he pressed, the woman grew silent. He had learned only fragments: that she had fled a group of men who took what they wanted, that she had been hunted across miles of wilderness, that her wound was a gift of their cruelty. Yet she never said why they wanted her so badly, never said what she carried or knew that made her such a prize. That mystery gnawed at him as much as the danger itself. That night, he moved them into the farmhouse, not trusting the barn walls to keep them safe if riders came in the dark. He barred the doors, set his rifle by the window, and kept the lanterns low. The house had never felt so small, every creak of the boards sounding like a warning. The woman lay on the cot near the hearth, the little girl curled beside her with a blanket pulled to her chin. He sat in a chair by the door, listening, his body tense as a drawn bow. The hours dragged on, and in the silence, his thoughts wandered back to his late wife. He remembered her laughter, the way she used to fill this very house with warmth. The stranger lying in the cot wasn't her, yet he couldn't ignore the way his daughter looked at her, the way she leaned into her as if trying to fill a hollow that had been empty too long. That hope was dangerous. It made him hesitate when he should be thinking only of survival. Just before dawn, the dog began barking furiously. The father leapt to his feet, rifle in hand, heart pounding. He peered through the crack in the shutters. Eastern sky was still dark, but against the pale strip of light he saw them. Riders, at least half a dozen. Maybe more, spread wide across the fields as they advanced. The woman sat up with a sharp breath, her face pale. "It's them," she whispered. The little girl woke and clung to her arm. "What do we do, Papa?" The father kept his voice steady. "We stay quiet. We wait." The hoofbeats grew louder, the sound carrying through the soil into the walls of the house. Dust rose in the gray light, and then voices cut through the morning air, rough, commanding. The kind of voices that carried authority through fear. The riders circled the property, their shadows stretching long across the fields. One of them dismounted near the barn, kicking open the door with a heavy boot. The crash echoed, and the little girl whimpered softly. The woman tightened her grip on her hand, whispering words of comfort, though her own body shook. The father held his rifle steady at the window, his finger brushing the trigger. He could see them clearly now. Hard men, armed with rifles and pistols, their faces set with the coldness of men who had seen too much violence to care for mercy. One of them, taller than the rest, shouted to his men, his words carrying across the yard. "She's here. Search every corner." The father's stomach dropped. They weren't guessing, they knew. Inside the house, the air thickened with fear. The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time she looked ready to speak the truth she had been holding back. Her lips parted, but the sound of boots on the porch silenced her. A heavy knock rattled the door. "Open up," a voice commanded, deep and steady. "We know what you've got in there. Hand her over, and no harm will come to the rest of you." The little girl clutched her father's arm, her face pale. "Don't let them take her, Papa." He swallowed hard, torn between fury and fear. His rifle felt heavy in his hands, but the weight of choice was heavier still. If he opened the door, he risked losing not just the stranger, but everything he had fought to protect. If he refused, he was declaring war on men who looked ready to burn his world to the ground. The knock came again, louder this time.
"Last chance, farmer."
"Hand her over." The woman sat straighter on the cot, her eyes fierce despite her trembling hands. "Don't," she whispered. "If you give me up, they'll take more. They'll take everything." The father's heart hammered. He looked at his daughter, who was staring at him with trust so deep it nearly broke him. He looked at the woman, her face pale but determined. And he looked at the door, where the shadow of a man shifted against the cracks in the wood. Outside, horses stamped and men muttered, the tension rising with each passing second. Inside, silence pressed against them, thick and suffocating. The father's finger tightened on the trigger, his breath steady, his eyes locked on the door. The next move would change everything. The riders waited. The house held its breath. And in that fragile stillness, the prairie seemed to lean closer, as if the land itself was waiting to see what choice would be made when the storm finally broke. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls of the farmhouse might collapse under its weight. The father stood at the door, rifle tight in his hands. The little girl pressed against his leg, the wounded woman watching from the cot with eyes that burned with urgency. The pounding came once more, harder this time, And then the voice again, rough and sure. "Last chance. We'll take her, or we'll take the whole place." The father's chest rose as he drew in a long breath. In that single moment, everything he had been holding back, the grief for his wife, the worry for his daughter, the doubts about the stranger, settled into a quiet certainty. He was not a man to give in to threats, and he would not surrender anyone under his roof to men who carried cruelty in their voices. He spoke low, steady, so his daughter and the woman could hear. "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, don't move." The door rattled again, then splintered as a boot slammed against it. The father leveled his rifle, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The first man shoved through, and the blast of the rifle cracked through the small house. The intruder staggered back, cursing, and the others shouted in alarm. Horses reared outside, hooves striking the dirt as chaos broke the stillness of morning. The woman pulled the girl close, shielding her as the sound of gunfire echoed across the farm. The father fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. He used every inch of cover, every shadow in the house, forcing the riders back with quick, sharp shots that sent them scrambling for shelter. For a while the world was nothing but thunder and smoke. When the noise faded at last, dust settled over the yard. 2 horses had bolted. Men shouted at one another, and the remaining riders gathered, retreating just beyond the fence line. The father stood, breathing hard, his rifle smoking, his shirt clinging with sweat. The door hung broken on its hinges, but the farmhouse still stood, and inside, the 2 souls he meant to protect were unharmed. The leader of the riders, tall and cold-eyed, raised his hand to silence his men. His voice cut through the distance. "This isn't over. She's marked, and we'll have her yet." With that, he turned his horse, the others following, their silhouettes fading into the horizon. The father kept his rifle ready until the last speck of dust disappeared. Only then did he lower it, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The little girl ran to him, clutching his waist, her tears wet against his shirt. He rested a rough hand on her hair, his jaw tight, his eyes soft. The woman sat on the edge of the cot, her face pale, her body trembling, but in her eyes was something stronger than fear, gratitude, mixed with a quiet sorrow. That evening, after the wreckage was cleared and the girl was tucked safely into bed, the woman spoke at last. She told the story she had carried like a burden through endless miles. She had been taken from her home by men who believed they owned whatever they laid claim to. She had escaped, wounded but determined, refusing to go back to a life of chains and silence. She had no family left, no place to return, only the will to keep moving until she found a refuge. That journey had led her here, to this farm, to this family, who owed her nothing yet had risked everything. The father listened without interrupting, his hands folded across his lap, his eyes steady. He could see the truth in her face, the weariness of someone who had endured more than most could bear. He said little when she finished, only nodded once, a silent acceptance that her story was now a part of theirs. Days passed in uneasy peace. The riders did not return, though the father kept his rifle close and his eyes sharp. The woman grew stronger, her steps steadier, her voice clearer. She helped with chores when she could, her hands learning the rhythms of farm life. The little girl followed her like a shadow, filling her days with laughter, questions, and trust. Slowly, the farmhouse felt less like a place haunted by loss and more like a home finding its breath again. Still, the father knew the danger had not vanished, and men like the ones who had come rarely forgot or forgave. But he also knew that life on the frontier was built on risk. Every seed planted in the soil was a gamble against drought or storm. Every family that settled here gambled against hardship and sorrow. Sometimes, the greatest gamble was opening the door to a stranger. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the little girl sat between them on the porch steps, her small hands clutching theirs. She leaned against the woman, her voice soft. "Are you staying, or do you have to go?" The question hung in the golden air, simple yet heavy. The woman looked out across the fields, her eyes tracing the horizon that had once promised only pain. Then she looked at the girl, whose gaze held nothing but hope, and at the man who had risked his life to shield her. Her lips trembled, but her answer was steady. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." The girl smiled so wide it seemed to light the whole farm. She buried her face against the woman's side, her voice muffled but sure. "Then you're my new mama." The father's throat tightened, his eyes fixed on the fading light. He didn't speak, not right away, but in the quiet he felt something stir within him, something he thought had been buried with his wife. It wasn't the same, could never be the same. But it was a beginning, fragile and real. In the weeks that followed, the farm began to change. The laughter of a child no longer echoed against empty walls, but mingled with the soft hum of a woman's voice. Meals were shared with warmth, chores lightened by companionship, and the fields stretched under the sun with the promise of another season. The riders never returned, and though the father remained watchful, he allowed himself moments of peace. He often thought back to that morning when his daughter had whispered in the barn, "Is that my new mama?" At the time it had seemed an innocent question born of longing. But now, it felt like a truth she had seen before anyone else. Children often sense the shape of things long before grown folks dare to believe. Life on the frontier was never free from hardship. Storms would come, droughts would threaten, and shadows would always linger at the edges of the land. Yet inside that farmhouse, 3 people found strength in one another. They were bound not by blood but by choice, by the simple act of standing together when the world outside tried to tear them apart. The father knew the future would not be easy, but as he watched his daughter laugh with the woman who now shared their table, he felt something he had not felt in years: hope. Not the kind that dreams blindly, but the kind that grows steady and strong, like roots reaching deep into the soil. The prairie wind still whispered its secrets through the grass, but now its song carried something brighter. It carried the story of a man, a child, and a woman who had been lost, each of them finding their way to the same place, the same family. It carried the promise that even in a world filled with dust and danger, love could be found again, unexpected and fierce. And so the farm stood, quiet against the vast sky, holding within its walls the memory of fear, the shadow of loss, and the bright, enduring flame of a family remade by chance, by courage, and by the simple, unyielding hope of a little girl's words.